So, spoiler alert, I'm a lesbian. I thought this was a pretty well-known fact, but I guess no one had thought to tell my old neighbours. Actually, they just presumed my girlfriend was my roommate, until they caught us kissing through the kitchen window. I remember that day, and how it was pretty normal. My neighbours seemed friendly enough, and were a little too perfect white family, but still friendly enough. The mother and I both had a garden, and we'd spend some time talking about the plants that we were growing. She always had a weird laugh, like a donkey trying to be feminine, but I ignored it. The laugh wasn't the weirdest part. It wasn't even 5 minutes after the kitchen window kiss that her husband was at our door. He was a big man, beefy, with a balding head of dark hair and thick eyebrows that seemed to move on their own accord. My girlfriend once said he looked like a Harry Potter character. I agreed. He started off with shouting at us. It was rather bizarre, since his shouting got so loud I had seen the across-the-street neighbour peek her head out to see what was wrong. He was yelling mainly the generic stuff. God's will, you're going to hell, how dare you talk to my children. Their sons were 18 and 21, so I thought that one was strange. My girlfriend, always the negotiator, managed to talk him down and send him back to his home. Later that night we went to bed, silent. Like speaking would remind us of what had just happened. I said we ought to move, as the neighbours obviously hated us. She said it didn't matter, there would always be rude neighbours, but I wish now that we had moved. The series of events following between that day and 5 months later, we had to find refuge in my brother's house, and it was god-awful. It started with my garden getting ripped out, my flower stems snapped, and their roots showing. My carrots, which I was so proud of, were upturned and smushed beneath a boot. Someone had taken a shovel and dug up clumps of dirt just to make sure nothing else could grow. I'm not ashamed to admit that I cried. When my girlfriend left for work an hour later, the D slur was carved over and over into the paintwork of our car. It covered nearly every inch of the left side door, and a few scattered across the right. Our headlights were smashed, and they had let the air out of our tires. She called in sick that day. One night at nearly 4 a.m, their eldest son stood at our door and rang the doorbell for 15 minutes straight. He only stopped when my girlfriend opened the upstairs window and said she would call the police if he didn't stop. He also urinated on our porch furniture. Every morning I would take our dog out for a mile-long walk. He's a golden retriever, so he needed the exercise. It didn't take long for the youngest to follow after us, shouting obscenities and saying he would expel the gay right out of me. It got so bad that our neighbour on the other side, a 20-something gym nut, had to start walking with me. One of them taped a note on our door saying they would burn the house down and burn us for our sins. The police said there was no evidence of who it was, so we just stopped going to the police altogether. Their sons filled water balloons up with urine and threw it at our house, and our dog's water bowl that was outside, too, had urine in it. Another time it was rat poison, though that seemed like too big of an accusation, so we convinced ourselves that we were wrong. I was continuously calling family members during this time, and my parents thought that what we were saying was crazy. It had to be some misunderstanding. That sounds like it came straight from a movie. It couldn't be that bad, they said. It was the rat poison that did it for us. Even though we told ourselves it was fake, the anxiety of one of us dying had gotten too much. I called my brother in tears, and he was there to help us pack up by the next day. He also chewed the Neighbours From Hell out, which was the perfect way for it to end. My name is Shen, and I live in France. If I remember correctly, it was 2017 when this happened. My half-brother and I, who are 18 and 19 years old, were at the time living in France, and the mother of my half-brother lives in Morocco. Every year we visit there, and this time around we decided to hire a car, as I'd recently gotten my license, and drive there through Spain. We took the road from the French Riviera, and we expected to be travelling for 3 days, including of course 2 nights at a hotel to rest between driving shifts. Everything was going well as we made our way through Spain, and we arrived in good time at the port of Malaga to then board the ferry to Morocco, arriving in Tangier. It was around 5:30 p.m. when we arrived at a hotel in Rabat, Morocco, so we settled in there and everything was fine. And now this is where things started to get weird. When booking into our room, the hostess was very helpful and professional. However, my brother and I were starting to find her a little strange. She asked, "What time exactly are you leaving tomorrow? Do you plan to take breaks on the road? Where exactly are you going? And where exactly is your car parked?" She tells us she's asking because it's so they can clean the car. We just answered her questions between the two of us and think nothing more of it. The hostess then asked us which road we were planning to take to get to Marrakesh. She suggested we take the road towards Casablanca, and was very insistent on it, without even giving us time to answer. She told us that going that way it would allow us to see beautiful landscapes, etc. So unfortunately, we followed her advice. The end of the day was nearing, and the car had not been washed like she said it would, but my brother and I, being very tired, didn't really care anyway, and we slept in late until noon. Once we were up and about, we decided to visit Tangier a little before hitting the road. It was now 10 p.m, and after eating we continued our journey. I prefer driving at night as it's more comfortable in these conditions. Everything so far was going well, and we're enjoying listening to music. We took a few breaks on the highway to get some air. Having dragged on a bit, it was getting late, and we still had 3 hours of road left before arriving. It was around midnight, and we were back on the road. Going along the highway, we could see there were very high lampposts, some of which were not functional, so there were many areas where it was quite dark. I was extra vigilant, being it was night time, and continuing on, we come to a group of around 7 people who were behind some security guardrails. I got a glimpse of them quite quickly and could see that they were crouching, as if they were trying to hide whilst watching the road. My brother at that time was asleep, so he didn't see anything. I kept on going without really giving it another thought, although I did find it strange. Being back in the darkness, I switched on my full beam headlights, and the second I did, I saw a man in the right lane. I was going around 120 to 130 kilometers an hour in the center lane, so I slowed down and reduced my speed to around 100 kilometers an hour. Upon seeing the man approaching our car, I deduced he must have been in his 40s, and as he did, he threw a rock or a big stone onto my windshield. I slammed on the brakes in total shock at what had just happened. I stopped the car immediately and peered into my rearview mirror, and I could see a dozen or so people running towards my car. Now I couldn't see brilliantly as it was dark, but I saw that their hands weren't empty. They had sticks, picks and bats, etc. Completely terrified, I got into first gear and sped out of there. I then turned to speak to my brother while still looking in my rearview mirror, but he didn't answer. I looked over at him directly, and I realized that he was unconscious. His skull was wide open, with blood flowing out, and the stone that had been launched is at his feet. I'm lost and I don't know what to do. I tried to put my hand on his wound to stop the blood whilst also driving, and I cry out his name repeatedly, trying to wake him up, but he doesn't respond. It's also late, so there's absolutely nobody about on the road, and the few cars that I do see don't stop. I haven't got a clue as to where the nearest hospital might be, so what am I going to do? Finally, a man rolled up and saw me waving for help, so he thankfully stopped. Now, I speak Arabic and I understand it, but when I do speak it, I have to reflect on my words, and in this panic it wasn't possible. But luckily he spoke French. I explained the situation and he told me that he'd get in the car and direct me to the nearest hospital, but he just has to get his phone from his car first, then we can go. This situation was becoming even more strange to me. It was dark and cold. Why not just guide me from his car? With my brother and the hospital in mind as my only goal, I didn't think about much else and accepted his offer. He climbed into the back and I started to drive. He apologized for not introducing himself properly and told me his name is Saeed and to take the first exit after about 10 kilometers. I introduced myself in turn by giving my first name. Suddenly I hear a beeping noise in the car. It was his phone, so he picked it up. Except it wasn't a phone at all. It was a walkie-talkie. The questions now multiply in my head. He spoke Arabic, and I understood both him and whoever he was talking to. I'm Algerian, and the Moroccans have more or less the same language, but he doesn't know this. Saeed said into his walkie-talkie, while speaking Arabic, "It is not them. It is not them, and it is not the right first name." The voice then asked him if he is sure, and Saeed tells him that, yes, he told us his first name is Mark. The voice then says, "He saw your face. We will have to rid of him." Then gives him an address to follow. I am frozen. I look at my brother, who is still not moving, and I try to think of a way to get out of this situation. I try to stay calm. Saeed tells me not to take the planned exit, and the next time he tells me it will be easier. So I followed his instruction. I feel that if I had refused, he would have suspected something. We went past the planned exit, and 2 minutes later, which were the longest 2 minutes of my life, I saw a vehicle that appeared to be a police brigade. I have to let them know I'm in danger. But how do I do it? I'm trapped. I'm only 5 meters away from them, so I decided to try and get their attention by flashing my headlights. Then maybe they'll see the windshield totally broken and stop me. Saeed raised his tone and told me to be careful. Thankfully, they signaled me to stop, so I did this, and Saeed then says, "It's not over," gets out and runs away from the car. I then break down and go to them in a panic, explaining the situation as best I can in Arabic. They called an ambulance which arrived quickly, and my brother was taken to the hospital. He was immediately transferred to France to the Toulon military hospital, in which he will be plunged into an artificial coma for 3 weeks, as his skull has been broken on the right side above his eye. He lost sight of that eye, but today everything is much better. He regains his sight little by little as time goes on. Saeed has not been found, but the man who threw the rock, which was 6.4 kilograms, was found and identified as being known for several beatings in an organized gang. He is currently serving a 40-year sentence, and the most shocking is yet to come. The woman, who was the hostess, was part of the coup, but she had disappeared. The inspector dealing with our case explained the gang's process of working. The hostess spots people passing by the hotel, and who are foreigners. When she asks where their car is, it is to transmit the license plate so that they can recognize the target. That's why she insisted that we take the road to Casablanca. They rob people, get rid of them, and take their cars. However, I explained the conversation between Saeed and the man who threw the stone, and when he told him, "It's not them, it's not the right name," the inspector told me that we were just very lucky. He couldn't figure out what that was all about. I decided to do some research of my own, and there have already been stories like this, where families with infants are attacked, and only infants disappear. Ultimately, I think the detectives were wrong on their theories, because when the hostess asked us what time we were going to leave, and I said we were leaving around 5 p.m, but we actually left the hotel at 5 p.m, and we got on the road at 10 p.m. They had our license plate, but not the people that they expected, and the group of criminals were probably expecting people other than us. It was the summer right after I'd graduated from high school, and a good friend and I decided to try our hand at camping. We grew up in the greater Los Angeles area, so our knowledge of the great outdoors was nothing beyond the couple of years we'd had in Cub Scouts of America when we were in elementary school. In other words, we had almost no idea what we were doing. We packed a tent, a couple of sleeping bags and supplies, etc., and headed off in his car. Note that I grew up in the 80s, so this is a time before the wide prevalence of cell phones and the existence of other portable digital devices. So we drove north on the 395 for about 6 hours, and then headed westward into the mountains, into the area of Inyo Canyon. Mistake number 1. We hadn't planned on which exact place to camp. We just played it by ear, like fools. And mistake number 2. We left in the mid-afternoon, so it was pitch black darkness by the time we'd arrived in the general area. We had driven off the main road and onto a dirt road in order to find a spot to camp, and the dust from driving on the dirt road overwhelmed the headlight high beams, so we finally decided to pull over and set up camp. It was now around 11:30 p.m, and we were exhausted and famished. At this point, any place was a good spot to camp for us, given we were so hungry and exhausted. Then came mistake number 3. We didn't bring any flashlights. We only had Bic lighters for our cigarettes. We tried to set up the tent using our lighters and the headlights of the car, which was parked about 10 to 15 feet away. The wind was blowing, so the lighter constantly went out after a few seconds, either directly because of the wind or indirectly because the wind would push the flame onto our thumbs. Clearly, we were being complete idiots. We'd finally finished setting up the tent, but at that point I was too tired to eat. My friend managed to make some instant ramen. We smoked a cigarette in the car, then crashed out in the tent. We awoke around 5:30 a.m. to a very cold morning. Immediately upon exiting the tent, we realized that we were camped at the entrance of a hiking trail, and there were at least 2 no camping signs in a visible distance from us. We dismantled the tent, cleaned up and cleared out. Later that morning we ended up buying some cheap flashlights and a nice hot meal in a very small town nearby. It wasn't really a town, but more like a few storefronts and shops on a main road that was about the length of an average city block. Back at the campsite, we went to some office, though I don't recall exactly what it was. It might have been a park ranger station or the office headquarters for the campground. In any case, we found and reserved a proper site for the night. The campground was basically like a large circle with campsites along its outer circumference, each one being about 50 yards from its neighbour, and in the middle of the circle was a common bathroom and shower. We circled around it once, and I think we saw one family that was all set up with a tent and camper, and we found our spot and set up, which was quite far from them. Later that night things got a little creepy, shall we say. My friend and I were laying in the tent, shining our flashlights upwards and chatting. Our new flashlights eventually gave out. Yes, they broke, and our fire pit was about 6 feet from the opening of our tent, and it was just a glowing ember. We probably should have completely put it out, and we probably shouldn't have had the tent so close. But in any case, there we were, chatting away and having a good time. My friend began to be distracted with his foot, and after the 3rd or 4th time getting up to check it, I asked him what was wrong. He told me that something was tapping his foot from the outside of the tent. His foot was against the side of it, so from the outside you would have been able to see a bulge in the side where his foot was. It was as if pebbles were being thrown at his foot through the tent. There it is again. What the hell? Each time it happened, there was a sound, like pebbles or a light tap. We sort of laughed it off, assuming that it was a twig or some grass moving in the wind, or perhaps it was a loose strap on the outside. Now, I don't recall exactly how it happened at first, But I do remember that we'd suddenly become silent at the same time, as a sound became audible to the both of us. It was footsteps, slowly moving towards our tent. We wondered if it was a bear or some other non-human animal, but it seemed distinctly bipedal. They were very slow and measured steps, like one every 2 seconds. I finally said in a whisper, "Someone's coming." My friend didn't move and his face was full of fear. At some point he'd bolted up and said, "Forget this," and grabbed his pipe. He stuffed it full of pot and took the biggest, deepest drags I've ever seen a person take. About a minute or two later he was out. Now, drugs aren't my thing, so I was now alone in the tent as far as a conscious body was concerned. I was sitting up at this point, and I had taken out the only weapon that I had. It was a Swiss Army pocket knife. I took out the big and small blades, as well as the ice pick in the middle, and held it like some ridiculous melee weapon. I could see the glowing embers in the fire pit through the sheer nylon material of our tent, and I was able to roughly but barely discern some of the rocks around it. I watched and listened intently as the footsteps came closer and at the same slow pace. With each step I could hear the dirt and rocks underfoot, crunching and grinding. At some point it was clear to me that whoever it was standing between the tent and the fire pit obscured my line of sight to the burning embers through the nylon tent. The footsteps stopped right at the front of the tent, about 6 to 8 inches. Everything was painstakingly silent for about 1 minute, and then I heard a click. At that exact same time, I could clearly see through the nylon tent wall. A flashlight was turned on. I was now able to see not just the flashlight, but the outline of the hand holding it. It was shining on the zipper entrance into the tent, just inches away from it. Blood drained out of my head and my palms instantly became dripping in sweat. I yelled out, "Who's there?" There was some fear in my voice, but it was mostly aggressive in tone. Whoever it was immediately turned off their flashlight. I didn't move, but neither did they. The person just stood there inches from the tent's only entrance, and my friend is out and totally unaware of what's going on. Nevertheless, I pretended that he was still awake and whispered, just loud enough to be audible to our visitor. "Yes, loaded. There's one in the chamber," as if my friend was awake and asked me about our gun. Mistake number 4. We didn't have a gun, or any real weapon of self-defense. It felt like an eternity, but after sitting still for at least 10 minutes, I heard feet slowly turning in the dark, then slowly walking away from the tent. I stayed up the whole night, and it wasn't until the light of dawn came through the tent that I crashed out. The heat inside the tent woke us up, and it was near noon by this point. We went outside to inspect the site, but found nothing missing. However, we did find footprints leading away from our campsite and outside the campground. That was the last time I went camping. I used to work as a housekeeper for this company that would assign me to different houses in the area that were hiring. One particular night, I had this one job at a house that was just a few towns over. I was a bit reluctant to go since it was late, but I knew an old back road that would cut the driving time in half. It used to be an old logging road, and there's tons of them here in Oregon that can be handy shortcuts to places. The one downside, though, was the road was small, windy, and if you got into a crash, you'd basically be in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by forest. I'm not sure it was completely legal to drive on it either, but I took it anyway. So I was driving down this road, feeling groggy and tired, when I felt a small collision on my trunk. I cursed and pulled over to inspect the damage and talk to the driver, who had seemingly come out of nowhere. He pulled up behind me. I got out and walked over to him and asked if he was okay. He was about 3 feet from the car, and I could see him sitting inside, but he wasn't getting out. It was winter and night, so everything was pitch black, and I could barely see anything, but I knew there was someone there. It was freezing cold, and I was getting creeped out. So I told him since there was barely any damage, I was just going to go. As I was walking back to my car, I heard his door open up behind me. I turned around and he just stood there. He was tall and had on a large black coat and baggy jeans. I stepped towards him and noticed something that made my heart sink. His hands were white-skinned, but his face looked dark. I squinted and realized he was wearing black makeup on his face. Now this scared me even more, because I was thinking he was wearing blackface, and for the record, I'm black, and he had followed me out here in the middle of nowhere to harm me. I turned and started for my car when I felt the cold tip of a gun press the back of my head. I was ready to cry at this point, thinking I was going to die alone out here, just because of my skin color, so I ended up trying to reason with him. I could barely choke out my words though, as I told him he didn't have to do this. Then suddenly something surprising happened. The guy started to cry as well, then jumped in his car and sped off. I should have gotten the license plate, but at that moment I was so scared I just got in my car, drove home and called my parents. I never, ever in my entire life thought I'd narrowly escape from being the victim of what was possibly a hate crime. I'm glad this guy had a change of heart though, or whatever you want to call his reasoning for sparing me. This happened when I was 12 and my brother was 17. And this is truly proof that the living are more terrifying than the dead. I think about this every Halloween. The community I grew up in was made up mostly of Hispanic people, so the folklore of La Llorona was very popular in the area and especially around Halloween. For those of you who don't know the myth of La Llorona, it is basically a story about a woman who married a rich man, had a perfect life, and then the man cheated on her. She was so distraught that she took her children to the river and drowned them. When she'd realized what she'd done, she threw herself in the river and drowned herself too. But she couldn't pass on to the afterlife without her children, so she roams the river looking for her kids. If she spots living children, she will grab them and drown them to take them to the afterlife with her. The story is meant to keep kids away from playing in the river. Now, most of my friends that year were too cool and grown up to go trick-or-treating and were planning on having a party instead. I was really disappointed and asked my brother if he would take me trick-or-treating. He agreed and we went while it was still light outside, so I would be able to make it to the party before it ended. Since we had gone too early, there weren't a lot of people ready to hand out candy, so after a disappointing trek, we started walking back home. On our way there, we passed by a park that had a river running next to it. On Halloween, older teens would usually wait at this park to try to see if they could spot La Llorona. Waiting to spot her at this particular park was a well-known town tradition that people had done for decades, and it still continues to this day. However, there were no kids or teens there yet because it was still a bit early, but there were people in the park putting on a Llorona play, so we decided to stop and watch it. There wasn't really much of an audience. It seemed like it was just us and another few kids who were a part of the group putting on the play, who just weren't in costumes and didn't have trick-or-treating buckets with them either. When we sat down, a woman approached us and asked us if we were trick-or-treating. I told her that we were, and she dropped a small comic book into my trick-or-treat bag and smiled. She seemed very kind and welcoming. The play then started, and that's when I got a weird feeling that something was off. The woman playing La Llorona pointed my brother and me out in the tiny audience and asked us what religion we were. To which my brother responded, Roman Catholic. She then told us that La Llorona was also a Roman Catholic and was burning in hell for her sins and rejecting Jesus. She then told us that Halloween was an evil holiday, and everyone that celebrated would burn forever. As the play went on, it got weirder and weirder, including a scene where La Llorona started talking about abortion, holding up a fake fetus, and pretended to eat it. My brother and I got up to leave, but the people stopped us, yelling at us to sit down, but we kept going anyway. They started following us down the street. So at that point, my brother grabbed my hand and we started running because he was afraid they were going to harm us. We finally got to our street and only about 3 people were still following us, yelling about how we were going to go to hell and we needed to accept Jesus. My brother and I went inside quickly and he locked the front doors. Then he frantically ran around the house making sure all the doors and windows were locked before he called our dad at his office. Our dad told us to call the police and that he'd be home in 15 minutes. When my dad got home, the people were still outside, chanting and singing some prayer song, asking God to save our souls. My dad shooed them away and told them the police would be there any second, but they weren't deterred and stayed there chanting until the police showed up and threatened to arrest them. I was so freaked out by the events that I decided I didn't want to go to the party and instead just wanted to organise my Halloween candy and put aside all the Snickers for my brother as a thank you for taking me trick-or-treating. Snickers were his favourite. My mum ordered pizza and we sat down to watch Halloween Town while I went through my trick-or-treat bag. I was halfway through sorting my candy when I came across the comic book that the lady had dropped in there. I opened it up and what was inside truly horrified me. It was a propaganda comic about a little boy who went to a haunted house, ended up being hit by a car on the way home, and went to hell because he hadn't found Jesus. I was really scared, and for weeks as a child, I had nightmares about the event and the comic book. Years later, I asked my mom if she'd remembered that night, and she told me that she couldn't forget it, and that she and my father had called the police over it several times. Apparently, for years, the group would leave envelopes with mine and my brother's names written on them, with different weird, creepy comic books and handwritten notes about how they were praying for us. They also gave us invitations to join them in their church, and weird promises about baking us cakes and other creepy ways to entice our child selves into their cult. To this day, we can't figure out how they knew our names or who wrote the letters, but it really creeps me out that they did this. I told a friend one time about the comic, and he knew exactly what they were. I ended up Googling it and finding the exact same comic online. If you want to see the comic that was given to me, you can view it in the description. This story happened around 4 years ago, and back then I was 18 and had just graduated high school. I decided to volunteer for a month in a Southern Asian country before my university year started, since volunteering was something I always wanted to do. I managed to find a place to volunteer at and was supposed to live for the first week with family friends, then I'd start living at my workplace. The thing is though, my workplace couldn't house me due to construction and having another female volunteer coming soon, so I had to find a hostel to stay in. My biggest mistake. I went onto the internet and started looking for a hostel, and sure enough I found one in the centre of the city, in a relatively safe area. Also, the hostel had many great reviews from other travellers, so it seemed safe to me. I visited the place and was greeted by Jay, who was the nephew of the owner and was responsible for greeting customers and showing them around. Jay was in his mid-20s, an average-looking dude, and probably around 5'8". I'm 6'3", and this will be important later. After I'd made the arrangements for my stay there and agreed to book in the next day, he invited me to go with him on a walk to show me around the neighbourhood, to which I said yes. During our walk, he told me about himself and that he'd lived in the UK for a bit. He told me about his family and asked if I smoke. Back then I was a cool kid, fresh out of high school, so I ecstatically told him yes, since I was trying to get some weed but didn't know how. He told me he can get it for me, and when I come tomorrow he will have some ready. The next day I arrived at the hostel, and he told me that he couldn't get it in the end, so I have to go with him in his friend's tuk-tuk to get it. George, his name was. In hindsight, that was a big red flag, but I was a dumb kid who really wanted to smoke, so I agreed to go with him. When we got there, George looked like a cartoon villain. All his facial features were sharp and narrow, and had the little Von Dyche beard to go with it. He basically was a 5'6" Jafar from Aladdin. We all got in the tuk-tuk and drove to the slums of the city to meet the dealer. I think the area was called Wanathamula, but I'm not sure. Anyway, we got the weed, then they told me that we were making a stop at George's house and smoking there for a bit. Fine by me. I had no reason to suspect them, since they were nice and polite with me. We reached his house, which was still in the slums, and it was a small room with a bed and 3 chairs. Nothing else. No tables or decor, or anything. I sat on a chair, Jay sat to my right, and George sat on the bed and started rolling out some joints for us. We began smoking and talking, when they started asking me about why I was here, how old I was, and stuff like that. Suddenly it started becoming a bit too personal though, as they were asking me what my parents do for a living, and how much they make. The question that really caught my attention though was, who are the people you live with, and do they know where you are? Are they going to worry about you if you don't call soon or anything like that? I was stoned until the moment they said that. I started sobering up quickly and realized that I was in a messed up situation here. I told them that I'm supposed to call them in a few hours, and that they know which hostel I was staying at. Suddenly another guy came over and just stood in the doorway, completely blocking it. He was my height but much bigger in size than me. I was trapped between them and had nowhere to go. Luckily they couldn't do anything to me though, since I'd told them I'd supposed to make a phone call to my family friends. Starting to get nervous, I told them that I was too baked and couldn't even move. I kept passing up on my turn to smoke, and I just lay there acting as if I was out of my mind. They started speaking in their native language, but it was clear that they were talking about me. Jay told them about all the electronics I had, and that I'd paid my full stay in cash. Now George, God bless his soul, thought I wasn't aware of my surroundings. So in perfect English, Jay told me he doesn't speak English. He started mocking me. He kept saying nice phone, and was asking me if I knew how to swim. I just looked at him and smiled, and told them it's time to go because I was tired. We walked out and I told them I needed to go to the market quickly, and asked them if they needed anything. They kept telling me that they'll get me whatever I wanted themselves, but I insisted that I wanted to go, and that they should send one of them with me. They sent the big guy. Now the market was across the street from a bus station, but the buses didn't stop there. They just slowed down and you hop in and out. Now was my chance. I waited until I saw a bus approaching and sprinted like my life depended on it, and it did, and I hopped in. They were screaming at me to come back and started running after the bus. The moment the bus reached the neighborhood of my family friends, I hopped out and walked around the neighborhood until morning came. I then made my way into work and told them that a tuk-tuk had tried to kidnap me. They escorted me to the hostel where I retrieved my belongings, and work allowed me to stay with them. When I told my family friends about what had happened, they said that it's a common scam here and that they were planning to steal my belongings and dump me in the river. When we'd left the house, that's why they asked if I knew how to swim and if someone was expecting me. This happened to me when I was about 12 or 13 years old, so it was about 15 years ago. I am a female, and the town that I live in has developed a lot since this story. But when this happened, there were a lot of factories spread out with lots of land in between them. There was a Walmart being built in the area too, but it had barely started construction. There was a main highway that ran through there, but my mum didn't like taking it as much, as traffic would get bad most of the time. The side streets we would take were desolate and not well lit. and there was also little to no cars taking these streets. I can't remember where we were coming from that night, but in the car was my mum, my brother, who was 3 years younger than me, and myself. My mum was obviously driving. I'm in the passenger seat and my brother was sitting behind me. Now my mum is the sweetest person ever, but is very adamant that she will never stop to help somebody on the side of the road or pick somebody up, especially when her kids were in the car. She does, however, make sure she calls the police so that they can help instead. It was around 9 p.m. and we were going home when my mum and I spotted someone on the side of the road, on the passenger side with their car hood up. Nothing out of the ordinary. My mum slowed down a little, since it was dark outside, and she didn't want to harm anybody that might be fixing their car. And as soon as we were close enough to them, this guy steps out from around the hood of his car and towards the street. He was waving us down. I don't remember much of a description of the guy because I wasn't paying too much attention, plus I could barely see him. But I do remember feeling bad that we weren't at least going to stop to see what he needed. The man at this point was in the middle of the road waving his hands, and as we got closer, we couldn't see anybody else in the car with him. So my mum swerved around him and told my brother to find her phone in her purse that was in the floor between the front and back seats. I looked at my mum as she looked in her rearview mirror, and her face became white and her eyes got wide. She suddenly slammed her foot on the accelerator, which is highly unusual for my mum, as she is really good at keeping to the speed limit. And at this point I knew for sure that something was wrong. My mum's voice became high and panicked, and she was frantically asking my brother where her phone was. I yelled at her, asking what was going on, as all this chaos was freaking my brother out. And with him being so little, he was crying and couldn't find the phone. My mum kept her eyes on the road, but kept glancing up continuously at her rearview mirror when she finally answered, "He's following us." I'm not exactly sure what she was talking about, but know that this isn't a good situation. My mum is now speeding towards the highway, and thank goodness there was no traffic. I looked in the back window and saw somebody passing cars, trying to keep up with us. I asked her where she was going, and she told me she was heading to the police station. As we were getting closer, my mum told me to jump out of the car as soon as she'd stopped, and to grab my brother from the back seat while she ran round the car to meet us. We stopped right in front of the police station and didn't even wait for the car to come to a stop before she put the car in park and opened my car door as fast as she could. I grabbed my brother, who was quickly opening his door, and I took off in a full sprint, with my brother in one hand and my mum in the other. When we'd finally spoken to a police officer is when I finally understood the full extent of what had just happened. My mum told the police officer that once we had passed the guy with a supposedly broken down car, he quickly ran to the hood of his car and slammed it shut. He then got in and sped after us. That was when my mum knew this guy had horrible intentions. She'd said he kept trying to speed up to get on the side of us, but she was able to go faster. Once my mum turned toward the police station, she said the guy had stopped following her, but she still wanted to get here in case he changed his mind. She gave the best description of the guy and his car, but because everything happened so fast, she didn't get a license plate number. I'm pretty sure the police never found him. I'm not sure what the guy had planned for us if we had actually stopped to help, but I know it was nothing good. I was on a date in Camden with a girl, who from photos I wasn't overly excited about, but in the flesh made my eyebrows shoot off my head. She was really pretty, smart and funny. We had quite a few cocktails, and I think it was the Blues Kitchen, before going to the gay bar in Camden, which has since closed down. I think it was called the Black Cap. So the date was going well, and we met some people who joined our table. Standing at the bar, the guy told me that my date said she wanted me to kiss her. I went over and did this, and it turned out that the guy was just helping us out by moving things along. My date was really shocked and told me it was a bold move, but she liked it anyway. At the end of the night, she came back to my hotel room with me, which was a 10-minute walk away. The room was kind of small, but cool, and space-age in style. We were both drunk and made out a lot, but then she started crying about problems she was having with a friend who was really sick, and her job was really stressful. She was full on sobbing. She left embarrassment even though I was worried about her leaving like that, but she said she would be okay. As she left, I saw a large man in a black thick leather jacket in the corridor. He was staring at my date as she left, and then stared at me as I closed the door. I was pretty wasted, so after checking my date got on a bus, I went back to my room and had a nap. I was woken up later by banging on the door. I ignored it at first, but it wouldn't stop. So I got up, staggered to the door, and opened it a crack. I recognized the leather elbow and arm as the door was shoved open violently. I was still drunk, and the jolt of the door caused me to fall over. Luckily, the room entrance was small enough, around the width of the door, so my back was against the wall by the door, while my feet touched the other side. My body kept the door closed as this man kept shoving against it. I finally managed to get it closed again, locked it, and went back to sleep, as I was still drunk. When I woke up in the morning, I thought I had dreamt the man and the door. But when I looked down at the side of my ribs, hips, and thigh, I had dark bruises. I was really lucky, and I am so glad that that room was tight on space, because if it hadn't been, that guy would have gotten in pretty easily. This is a convoluted story, so bear with me as I try to convey everything I can recall about what led me to the conclusion that my ex-housemate could potentially have been a serial killer or serial killer in the making. It was the summer of 2015 when I moved in, and at first appearances, my housemate landlord Mike was somewhat normal, if not a bit socially awkward and dysfunctional. When I was signing the papers, he was adamant that I should never go into the basement, which I thought was odd, but I really needed a place to stay. And, well, people have their little quirks, so I just chalked it up to that at the time. As I got to know Mike, and our cohabitation continued, I learned more about the depths of his dysfunction. Firstly, that he used meth. Now, I don't automatically judge people based on their vices, but I was surprised at the extent of his use. He was probably the first person I knew who used meth, balanced a full-time job, and enjoyed a decent amount of success. The reason this is important to the story is that when he would be around the house, drinking and using meth, he would start to run off at the mouth. He would often joke that if I smelled lye coming from the basement, not to think anything of it. I think it was probably the third time he said this that I asked why he keeps saying it. And he said, "Well, I use chemicals to clean up after the bodies," with a wily grin on his face. I tried to chalk that up to the bad sense of humour, but it didn't sit right with me. He was also very particular that I let him know of my coming and going, and my work schedule. I remember him being shocked and uncomfortable one day that I'd ended up taking a day off of work because he didn't realise that I was home. I remember that day because there was a lot of clanging, and what sounded like muffled shouting coming from the basement. His car was in the driveway, but he was not in the main house, or his bedroom. Other days he would play very loud music that bumped through the whole house. Sometimes he would even play NPR talk radio at those volumes. In retrospect, I think he may have been trying to mask sounds. He would make remarks about sex workers, saying, "You can do whatever you want. You can choke them or beat them to death and nobody cares." I took exception to this. I told him I thought that he was messed up. But when he would get tweaking, he'd always come back around to alluding to the same kind of violence, talking about how he was a normal white guy who owned a house and had a good career, so the police would never suspect him. At this point, I started to think that it had gone too far to simply be a joke. I was in a weird position, because money was tight at the time, and my options were few. I tried to convince myself that even if he was messed up, he is probably just engaging in outward fantasism. I knew that he would acquire the services of sex workers on occasion, but again, did not judge that activity at face value, but started becoming concerned. Then at one point when I was doing laundry, I caught whiffs of decomposition. The house we were in was in southeast Portland. It was relatively new, having grown up in upstate New York. I know that animals can be trapped in walls and die, but this was the garage, and there was no animals scurrying in the walls. This was strange to say the least, and very telling to me. I considered carefully what I would do, and decided I would confront him about the smell. I decided to poise the question in a somewhat suggestive way, by expanding on his jokes. I told him that he needs to do a better job cleaning up the bodies, because I smelled decomposition from the garage. I will never forget his reaction. His eyes widened, and he shot me a sharp glare. Somewhere between fear and anger. He stumbled over his words and eventually responded, "What? Really?" I said yes, really, and there was a few seconds of awkwardness before he said, "Thanks for letting me know," and promptly went into his bedroom and shut the door. A few days after that, he went into the upper crawl space in the garage, while I was again doing laundry. He called for me and was trying to convince me to come up into the crawl space. My body locked up, and it was like my instincts were screaming at me that if I went up there, I would not come back down. I gave some excuse that I can sparsely remember, that I had to be someplace, packed up my laundry, threw it in my room and left. He spent a lot of time in the padlocked basement without a doorknob. The only way in was through the backyard. I wish I would have gone down there in retrospect, to either confirm or dismiss the suspicions once and for all. In the last couple of months I had lived there, I was privy to more graphic comments about women and sex workers, explicit talk of sexual violence, and he was using more and more. He once showed me a video he'd made. He is a graphic designer and artist as well, which featured heavy bondage themes, interspersed with distorted audio of women screaming, and this strange leering figure in a plague doctor costume. It was one of those situations where any one of these things alone may be innocuous, but as they accumulated it became suspicious to me. It was October of 2016 that I left there, taking off to Oseti Oyati camp during the anti-pipeline protests with Standing Rock, Lakota. A mix of feeling called to action and having nothing to lose, as I wanted to get out of that house in the worst way. My last night there, I did not give notice that I was leaving. He was drinking and tweaking again. He started in on the same conversation, loosely describing murder and sexual violence in the tone of some sort of edgy joke. I told him he would be caught eventually, not even holding back my suspicion anymore. He reiterated that he was the last person police would suspect, and asserted that they wouldn't catch him. He said this in a very serious and concise way, dropping the pretense he had been using before. I left the next morning. Now this haunted me for months, then a year and a half. I felt as though I hadn't done anything. The guilt was eating away at me. So I called Portland Crime Stoppers and put in an anonymous tip describing what I had described here. When I did, the operator started going back and forth, putting me on hold, because the call had piqued the interest of the police sergeant, who was assigned to the call center. So they were asking me detailed questions about his vehicle, his house, the methods he described, etc. It seemed like they were taking interest, so I gave them as much information as I could remember, and left it at that, feeling just a little better that I had at least tried to do something about it. Fast forward to recent times. I told my mother about all of this, and she became interested, asking what house this was, and she ended up pulling it up on G-Maps. She pulled up the street view, and I noticed that there was a large enclosed trailer in the driveway that wasn't there when I was. I could theorize why it might have been there, but cannot put together a practical reason for it, or why he'd been using it, unless he was moving or using it to haul things to discard. Admittedly, that is pure conjecture, but I couldn't help but wonder. I doubt that I will ever get closure or have my suspicions validated, unless he does finally get caught and arrested, and I read about it. I have grown up poor and been around the lowlife a lot. I have interacted with many sketchy and unsavory people in my time, but none of them have ever made the impression that Mike made on me. Make of it what you will, but I hope I never meet him again. When I was 13, I broke my leg in a nasty bicycle accident. I ended up in a plaster cast from my hip to my ankle for 8 weeks, and as it was coming up to Christmas, my younger brother wanted to go to the theatre to see the Christmas show that was on. I was 13, moody, and accompanied by a bright pink cast everywhere I went. I was not feeling it. My dad, never one for going to the theatre, offered to take me to Pizza Hut instead. It was a rare opportunity to spend time with my dad, who was often working very long hours as he worked as a police officer, which at the time I didn't really take an interest in. We had a great evening together at the restaurant, and when we got back into the car to go home, with full bellies and some leftover pizza, I remember babbling away to my dad, as I had been the whole night. Enthralled, I had my dad's undivided attention. After a while I noticed he wasn't really responding anymore. We were fairly near home, but still on main roads before we turned off towards our housing estate. At first I thought he'd just lost interest, but I glanced across and noticed he was permanently looking in the rearview mirror. I asked him what was up, and he said, "The car behind us has followed us all the way from Pizza Hut." I glanced behind and commented that we were still on the main road. I couldn't see that this was an unusual route for this guy to take. He said, "I need to see whether he is. I don't want to lead this guy to our house." I rolled my eyes. My dad was always paranoid about stuff like that. We couldn't even tell friends we were going on holiday because he was convinced the house would be broken into while we were away. We were coming up to a residential area before ours that I knew from doing a paper round. I suggested the street coming up on the left, as it looped around in a horseshoe shape through a housing estate and brings you back out to the same main road we were on. Nobody would take this road to come out onto the main road again. My dad turned off, and so did the car. I will never forget that feeling, that sinking feeling as I watched the car sharply turn behind ours. The car placed its full beams on. I let out a gasp and looked to my dad. He'd gone into work mode. He had completely shut me out. He accelerated down the street, and as we came to the main road, I saw there were many cars still on it. He pulled straight out onto the main road, meaning the oncoming traffic needed to brake sharply, and they held their horn down at us. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, breathing deeply as my dad weaved in and out of lanes. A part of me was completely terrified, and a part of me was still convinced this was not really happening, that he had exaggerated or mistaken this. He wasn't really following us. I dared to look into the side mirror and saw it was a different car behind us. I felt myself relax a little, and we turned left at the coming roundabout, giving very little room to anyone, and a few moments of holding my breath thinking we were going to hear the sound of metal on metal. The street we had turned onto was slightly quieter than the road previously. I slowly glanced into the side mirror, and it was still a different car behind us. I sighed in relief and thought this had really been my dad's imagination. Suddenly the rearview mirror became completely illuminated again, and I awkwardly turned in my seat to see a car pull out sharply from behind us again. I looked to my dad again, and he grabbed his phone from his pocket and told me to call someone in particular and put it on speaker. My hands were shaking. I could barely press the buttons. A cheerful voice answered, and before he could say anything else, my dad quickly summarized what had happened. There was a pause, and I could hear voices speaking in the background, radios, beeping and answering through radios. My dad barked at me to keep naming the streets we were on to the guy on the phone, as my dad randomly turned down streets, trying to keep to main roads. I'm randomly calling names and trying to remember to say the direction we were heading. The car was so close behind us and completely blinding any view. All I could think was, please don't hit us. If we crash, I can't run. What the hell can I do? My leg had only just been plastered. I knew I stood no chance, and I suddenly wondered if they were getting close enough to take a shot at us. This for me was unthinkable. It was England. That is not the norm. Why the hell would someone want to shoot us? We continued to weave down streets and random turns as I was tossed around the front seat, clutching onto the mobile in my trembling hands. The voice on the phone shouted, "Turn into the Tesco car park. That's coming up on the left. We have 3 response vehicles coming from the other direction." My dad sharply turned into the car park, skipping the red light. I shut my eyes, again waiting for the sound of metal on metal. As we swung into the near empty car park, the car behind us in close pursuit, blue lights surrounded our car from what felt like all directions. The sound of sirens was deafening. My dad got straight out of the car and ran behind it. I screamed, still thinking someone could have had a gun, and tried to look over my shoulder to see when my door swung open and a police officer was crouching into the car to help me get out. My arms had completely turned to jelly. I couldn't even use the crutches to help me stand. Another police officer came, and between them they helped me as I hopped to the back of the police car. They were kind and tried to distract me as I was trying to see what was going on and where my dad was. I couldn't really see from my angle, and I also couldn't turn properly due to my leg. They did their best to reassure me, and one of them had clearly just been through the nearby McDonald's drive-thru and offered me his dinner. I just sobbed, begging them to tell me what was going on. Now my dad, after some time, came over to the car and told them to take me home. He had checked and my mum was back home with my brother. As the police car turned around in the car park back towards the entrance, we could see the police surrounding the vehicle, and 3 men in what looked to be their late 20s were handcuffed, leaning over the car, whilst a sniffer dog and 2 police officers were taking things out of the vehicle, one object being a baseball bat. When my dad got home later that night, I asked him what it was about. Who the hell were those men, and why were they following us? He was very reluctant to tell me anything, but he did admit it was because of him that they were following us. He'd explained that he was in a drugs team that dealt with, how I understand this as an adult, the interception of large shipments of drugs that were being transferred across the country, and sometimes people lost a lot of money when they were caught. I just stared at him. I had no idea what to say. He just shrugged and said, "Sometimes people get upset about that.